The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. He was trying to think of something with which to impress the officer, but at that moment Stockmann entered. "You prodigal, you little devil," Stockmann shouted, putting his arm round Mishka's back. "What are you cross-examining him for, comrade?" He turned to the officer. "He's one of our own boys. Why didn't you send for me or Kotlyarov, and then there wouldn't have been any need for questions? Come on, Mikhail. But how did you escape? Tell me, how did you escape? We'd struck you off the list of the living. We thought you'd died the death of a hero." Mishka remembered how he had been taken prisoner, his failure to defend himself, his rifle left in the sledge, and flushed painfully. Chapter 3. The shed stank strongly of rotten straw, dry dung, and wisps of hay. In the daytime a gray light filtered through the roof. At night there was the squeaking of mice and silence. The mistress of the hut surreptitiously brought Gregor food once a day in the evening. A pitcher of water stood buried in the dung fuel bricks. Life wouldn't have been too bad, but he had smoked all his tobacco. He was tormented by his situation during the first day, and unable to hold out without something to smoke. In the morning he crawled over the earthen floor and collected some dry horse dung in his hands. He rubbed it in his palms and made it into cigarettes. In the evening the master sent him withered leaves torn from a copy of the Gospels, a box of sulphur matches, and a handful of dry clover and roots. Gregor was overjoyed, smoked until he was nearly sick, and had his first sound sleep on the dung bricks. Next morning he was awakened by his Cossack friend running into the shed and shouting sharply, "You asleep? Get up! The dawn has broken its ice!" And he laughed heartily. Gregor jumped to the floor, bringing the dung bricks rumbling down behind him. "What's happened?" he demanded. "The Yelanska and Vyeshenska Cossacks have risen on this side. Foremen and all the government at Vyeshenska have fled to Tokhin. They say that Kazanska, Sumilinsk, and Migulinsk districts have also risen." The bunches of veins swelled on Gregor's brow and neck. His eyes spurted little green sparks. He could not conceal his joy. His voice trembled. His black fingers fidgeted with the fastenings of his greatcoat. "And here in your village, has anything happened here?" he asked. "I've heard nothing. I saw the chairman just now, and he laughed. 'I don't care what God we pray to so long as there is a God,' he said. 'But you can come out of your hole.'" They went into the hut. Gregor walked with great strides, and the Cossack hurried at his side, telling him the news. In Yelanska district, Krasnoyarsk was the first to rise. 2 days ago, a score of the Yelanska communists went to arrest some Cossacks. The Krasnoyarsk men heard of it, got together, and decided, "How long are we going to stand this? They're taking our fathers. They'll be taking us next. Saddle horses, and we'll go and get the arrested men free." Some 15 fine lads were collected. They had only a couple of rifles, some swords and pikes. They found the communists resting in a yard at Melnikov, and poured into the attack on their horses. But it was surrounded by a stone wall, and they were beaten off. The communists killed one of them, peace to his soul, but from that moment the end of the Soviet regime was near, damn it. Gregor greedily ate the remains of his breakfast and went with his friend into the street. The Cossacks were standing about in little groups at the corners, as though the day was a holiday. They went up to one group. The Cossacks raised their hands to their caps in greeting, and replied restrainedly, staring expectantly and curiously at Gregor's unfamiliar figure. "He's one of us. Don't be afraid. You've heard of the Melyukhovs of Tatarsk? This is Pantoleymon's son Gregor. He came to me to save himself, being shot," the master said proudly. They began to talk, but just as one of the Cossacks was telling how the Reds had been driven out of Vyeshenska, 2 horsemen appeared at the end of the street. They galloped along, stopping by each group of Cossacks, turning their horses and shouting something, waving their arms. Gregor waited eagerly for their approach. "They're not any of our villagers. They're messengers from somewhere," one of the Cossacks remarked as he stared. The two men rode up to the group. One of them, an old man with sheepskin flung wide open, his face red and sweating, his gray hair hanging over his forehead, youthfully reined in his horse and stretched out his right hand. "Cossacks, why are you standing at the street corners like women?" he cried. Tears broke his voice. His livid cheeks quivered with his agitation. "What are you standing for, sons of the dawn? They're shooting your fathers and grandfathers. They're taking away your possessions. The Jewish commissars are jeering at our faith, and you're chewing sunflower seeds and playing cards. You're waiting till the Russian noose tightens round our throats. All Yalansk district from small to great has risen. They've driven the Reds out of Yashenska, and you. Have you got peasants' kvass instead of Cossack blood in your veins? Rise, get your arms. Krivsky village has sent us to raise your village, to horse Cossacks, before it's too late." He fixed his frenzied eyes on the face of one elderly acquaintance, and shouted with great scorn, "What are you standing there for, Semyon Kristoforovich? The Reds cut down your son at Filanova, and you're saving yourself on the stove." Gregor did not stay to hear more. He ran towards the yard. Tearing his nails till they bled, he dug his saddle out of the dung blocks, saddled his horse, brought it at a run out of the chaff shed, and flew through the gate as though possessed. "I'm off, God be with you," he managed to shout to his friend, and bending over the saddle bow right against his horse's neck, lashing the animal with his whip, he put it into a gallop. The snowy dust settled again behind him. His legs rubbed against the saddle. The stirrups clattered loosely against his boots. He felt such a tremendous, ferocious gladness, such an influx of strength and resolution, that, despite himself, a whistling rattle burst from his throat. His imprisoned secret feelings were released within him. Now it seemed at last that his road henceforth was clear as a moonlit track. During the exhausting days when he had been hiding like an animal in the dung blocks, and starting at every sound and voice outside, he had weighed and decided everything. It was as though those days of search for the truth, those hesitations, those transitions and painful inward struggles had never been. Like the shadow of a cloud they had passed, and now his searchings seemed aimless and empty. What had there been to think about? Why had his spirit tossed like a hunted wolf in search of a way of escape, of a resolution of the contradictions? Life seemed absurdly, wisely simple. Now he believed that there never had been any truth beneath whose wing all might shelter. Now he thought that each had his own truth, his own furrow. For a piece of bread, for a strip of earth, for the right to live, men always had fought and would fight so long as the sun shone on them, so long as their blood flowed warmly through their veins. Those who wanted to deprive him of his life, of his right to live, must be fought, and fought resolutely with no wavering, but steeled with hatred. His feelings must not be bridled, must be given rein. The path of the Cossacks had crossed the path of the landless peasantry of Russia, the path of the factory people. Fight them, wrest from them the heavy dawn earth, washed with Cossack blood. Drive them as once the Tatars had been driven beyond the bounds of the province. Strike Moscow, fasten a shameful peace on them. There is no passing on the causeway. Someone must push aside someone. So they had tried their hand, so they had released the Red regiments on the Cossack lands, then to sword. Flaming with a blind hatred, Gregor galloped until his horse carried him across the white-maned pall of the dawn. For one moment a doubt assailed him. It's rich against poor, and not Cossack against Russian. Mishka Koshevoy and Ivan Alexeyevich are Cossacks too, and they're red through and through. But he angrily shook off the thought. Tatarsk appeared in the distance. He pulled on the reins. His horse, foaming like soap, dropped into an easy trot. At his own gate he urged it on again. Its breast flung open the wicket gate, and it galloped into the yard. Chapter 4. By the day of Gregor's arrival in Tatarsk, 2 companies of Cossacks had already been assembled. A village assembly had decided to mobilize all men capable of bearing arms, from 16 to 60. Many felt the hopelessness of the position. In the north was the Voronezh province, held by the Bolsheviks, and the Khapersk district, sympathetic to the Reds. In the south was the front, which might turn back and crush the insurgents under its avalanche. Certain more cautious Cossacks did not want to take up arms, but they were compelled. Stepan Astakhov flatly refused to go and fight. "I'm not going," he declared when Gregor, Christonia, and Anikushka went to see him in the morning. "Take my horse, do what you like with me, but I don't want to take up a rifle." "What do you mean you don't want to?" Gregor demanded, his nostrils quivering. "I don't want to, and that's all." "And if the Reds take the village, what will you do? Will you clear out or stay behind?" Stepan turned his eyes from Gregor to Aksenia and replied after a pause, "We shall see." "If that's the case, get outside. Take him, Christonia. We'll put you up against a wall at once." Trying to avoid looking at Aksenia huddled up against the stove, Gregor pulled Stepan by his sleeve. "Come on." "Gregor, don't be a fool. Let go." Stepan turned pale and feebly resisted. Christonia seized him from behind around the waist and muttered, "If that's your spirit, then come on." "Brothers." "We're no brothers of yours. Come on, I tell you." "Let me go. I'll join the company. I'm weak after typhus." Gregor smiled wryly and let go of Stepan's sleeve. "Go and get a rifle," he said. "You should have joined long since." He went out without a word of farewell. But even after what had happened, Christonia had no compunction in asking Stepan for some tobacco, and sat talking as though nothing had occurred between them. Towards evening, 2 sledge-loads of arms were brought from Vyazhenska, including 84 rifles and more than 100 swords. Many Cossacks turned out hidden weapons. The village mustered 211 Cossacks, of which 150 were horsed, while the others marched on foot. The insurgents were still without a unified organization. The villages were acting uncoordinately, independently forming squadrons, electing commanders from the most militant of the Cossacks, taking into account not rank but services. They undertook no offensive operations, and only made contact with the neighboring villages and sent out mounted patrols. Before Gregor's arrival, his brother Pyotr had been chosen as commander of the mounted squadron in Tatarsk, while Latishev took command of the infantry. The artillerymen, with Ivan Tomilin as their head, had gone off to a nearby village where the Reds had left a damaged field gun and were trying to repair it. The firearms brought from Vyazhenska were distributed among the Cossacks. Panteleimon, released with the others from Mokhov's cellar, dug up his machine gun, but there were no cartridge belts, and the squadron would not accept the gun as part of their equipment. The next evening, news came that a punitive division of Red soldiers, numbering some 300, with 7 field guns and 12 machine guns, were advancing from Kargin to suppress the rising. Pyotr resolved to send out a strong patrol, and also informed Vyazhenska. The patrol of 32 men under Gregor's command left in the twilight. They galloped out of the village, maintaining the same pace almost as far as Tokin. Some 2 miles this side of the village, close to a shallow gully, Gregor dismounted his Cossacks and distributed them in the gully. The horses were led off into a dell, where deep snow was lying. He sent 3 Cossacks, Anikushka, Martin Shamil, and Prokhor Zychov, onto the villages. They set out at a walking pace. Night had fallen. Low clouds rolled over the steppe. The Cossacks sat silently in the gully. Gregor watched the silhouettes of the 3 horsemen until they dropped over the hill and blended with the black outline of the road. Now their horses were no longer visible, only their heads could be seen. Then they disappeared completely. A moment or 2 later, a machine gun began to stutter on the other side of the hill. Then another, evidently a hand machine gun, broke out in a higher tone. The handgun lapsed into silence, and after a brief pause, the first gun hurriedly finished another belt. A hail of bullets swept through the dusk high above the gully. The 3 Cossacks came galloping back at full speed. "We ran into an outpost," Prokhorezhikov shouted, when still some way off. Gregor gave orders for the horses to be held in readiness, then jumped out of the gully and, taking no notice of the bullets burying themselves with a whistle in the snow, went to meet the Cossacks. "Did you see anything?" he demanded. "We could hear them moving about. There must be a lot of them, judging by the voices," Anikushka pantingly told him. While Gregor was questioning them, 8 Cossacks ran down from the gully to where the horses were stationed, mounted their horses, and galloped off in the direction of home. "We'll shoot them tomorrow," Gregor said quietly as he listened to the sound of the retreating hoofs. The Cossacks left in his command sat on for another hour, preserving a strict silence and straining their ears. At last someone caught the sound of horses' hoofs. "They're coming from Tokin direction," he declared. "A patrol? It can't be." They whispered to one another and poked their heads over the top of the gully, vainly trying to distinguish something in the impenetrable darkness. Fyodor Borovskov's Kalmyk eyes were the first to discern the approaching riders. "Here they come," he said confidently, unslinging his rifle. Some 10 horsemen were riding quietly and in broken rank along the road. Half a length in front of the others was a stately, warmly clad figure. Staring up at them against the dark background of the sky, Gregor could distinctly see the line of the horses' bodies, the outlines of their riders, and even the flat fur cap of the leader. The horsemen were only some 30 yards away, and it seemed that they must surely hear the Cossacks' hoarse breathing and the heavy beat of their hearts. Gregor had already issued orders for fire to be held until he gave the command. He was waiting confidently and calculatingly for the right moment. He had already decided on his plan. He would challenge the riders and would open fire when they reined together in confusion. Quietly the snow scrunched on the road. Little yellow sparks occasionally flew up from the horses' hooves as their shoes slipped on a bare stone. "Who goes there?" Gregor lightly jumped over the edge of the gully and stood up. His Cossacks poured after him, but Gregor was unprepared for what followed. "Whom do you want?" the leading rider asked in a hoarse voice that betrayed no sign of fear or surprise. The man turned his horse in Gregor's direction. "Who are you?" Gregor shouted sternly, not stirring from the spot and half raising his revolver. The man replied loudly and angrily, "Who's daring to shout like that? I'm the commander of the punitive expedition and am empowered by the staff of the 8th Red Army to suppress the revolt. Who is your commander? Let him come here." "I'm the commander." "You? Ah." Gregor saw a black mass in the rider's uplifted hand and dropped to the ground, shouting, "Fire!" A flat-headed bullet from the man's Browning flew over his head. A deafening roar of shouts broke out from both parties. Borovskov ran and clung to the reins of the Red Commander's horse. Stretching across him, Gregor struck with the flat of his sword at the man's head and brought him tumbling from the saddle. The engagement was over in a couple of minutes. 3 Red Army men galloped off, 2 were killed, and the remainder disarmed. Gregor curtly cross-examined the Red Commander, thrusting the barrel of his revolver into the man's mouth. "What's your name, you serpent?" "Likhachev." "What were you hoping to do, riding with only 9 men as bodyguard? Did you think the Cossacks would fall on their knees before you and ask forgiveness?" "Kill me." "All in good time," Gregor consoled him. "Where are your documents?" "In my pack." "Take them, you bandit. Swine." Paying no attention to Likhachev's curses, Gregor himself searched him, pulled a second Browning out of the pocket of his sheepskin jacket, and removed his Mauser and field pack. In a side pocket he found a cigarette case and a small notebook of papers. Likhachev cursed and groaned incessantly. Gregor's blow had struck his head and slipped to his right shoulder. "Take off your jacket, Commissar," Gregor commanded. "You're sleek, you've grown fat on Cossack bread, and I don't think you'll freeze." The prisoners' hands were bound behind them with bridles and straps, and they were seated on their horses. The party spent the night in Basky, not far from Vyeshenska. Likhachev tossed about on the floor by the stove, groaning and grinding his teeth. Gregor washed and bound up his shoulder, but he refused to answer the man's questions. He sat at the table studying the captured documents, the lists of Vyeshenska counter-revolutionaries supplied by the Revolutionary Tribunal, the notebook, letters, and marks on the map. Occasionally he stared at Likhachev, exchanging glances as though crossing swords. The Cossacks remained awake all night, going out from time to time to see to their horses, or lying and talking and smoking in the porch. Just before dawn, Gregor dozed off, but quickly awoke and raised his head from the table. He saw Likhachev seated on the straw, untying the bandage with his teeth and tearing away the compress. He glanced up at Gregor with harsh, bloodshot eyes. His teeth were bared tormentedly, and his eyes gleamed with such deathly agony that Gregor's drowsiness passed as though removed by an invisible hand. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "What the hell is it to do with you? I want to die," Likhachev roared, paling and dropping his head on the straw. During the night he had drunk half a bucket of water, and had not once closed his eyes. In the morning, Gregor sent him by sledge to Vyeshenska, together with the captured documents and a brief report. Escorted by 2 mounted Cossacks, the sledge rattled up to the red brick building of the executive committee in Vyeshenska. Likhachev half lay in the back. He rose, with one hand holding the blood-soaked bandage. The Cossacks dismounted and conducted him into the house. Some 50 Cossacks were crowded in the room occupied by the provisional commander of the United Insurgent Forces. Likhachev stumbled to the table where Suyarov, the commander, a little Cossack with no outstanding characteristics except perhaps the derisive slits of his yellow eyes, was sitting. He glanced at Likhachev and asked, "So you're Likhachev, my lad?" "Yes, there are my documents." The Red Commander threw his notebook onto the table and stared obstinately and sternly at Suyarov. "I regret that I have failed to execute my instructions to crush you like snakes, but Soviet Russia will deal with you as you deserve. Please shoot me at once." "No, Comrade Likhachev. We've ourselves revolted against shootings. We're not like you. We don't shoot people. We'll heal your wound, and you may yet be of service to us," Suyarov replied, his eyes gleaming mildly. He turned to the crowd. "Outside, all of you, hurry up." Only the commanders of 5 companies were left in the room. They sat down at the table. Someone pushed a stool across to Likhachev with his foot, but he refused to sit down. He leaned against the wall, staring over their heads out of the window. "Well now, Likhachev," Suyarov began after exchanging glances with the company commanders, "tell us how many there are in your detachment." "I won't." "You won't? Well, it doesn't matter. We shall get it from your papers, and if not, we'll examine your Red Guard. One other thing we ask you. Write to your detachment to come on to Vyeshenska. We've got nothing to fight with you about. We're not against the Soviet government, but against the Communists and Jews. We'll disarm your men and send them home, and we'll let you go free. In a word, write that we're toilers too, and that they needn't be afraid of us. We're not against the Soviets." Likhachev spat right on Suyarov's little gray beard. He wiped his beard with his sleeve and went red in the face. One of the commanders smiled, but no one rose to defend the honor of their leader. "So you're insulting us, Comrade Likhachev," Suyarov spoke with obvious insincerity. "The atamans and officers used to insult us and spit on us, and you, a communist, also spit? Yet you all say you're on the side of the people. Well, tomorrow we'll send you to Kazanska." "Won't you think it over?" one of the company commanders asked sternly. Likhachev adjusted the coat across his shoulders and turned to the guard at the door. Yet they did not shoot him. The insurgents were struggling to resist shootings and pillagings. The next day he was driven to Kazanska. He walked in front of his mounted guard, lightly stepping over the snow, his eyebrows knitted. But in the forest, as he passed a deathly white birch, He smiled vividly, stopped, stretched out his sound arm, and tore off a twig. On it, little buds were already swelling with the sweet March juices, and the vernal aroma of life was coming from them. Likhachev thrust the buds into his mouth and chewed them, gazing with misty eyes at the trees fresh with the young spring, and smiling at the corners of his lips. He died with the black petals of the buds on his lips. 5 miles from Vyashenska in the sandy dunes, the guards bestially cut him down. While he was still alive, they thrust their sword points into his eyes, cut off his arms, his ears, his nose, slashed a cross over his face. They unbuttoned his trousers and, outraged, defiled his great, handsome, masculine body. They outraged the bleeding stump. Then one of them stepped on his quivering chest, and with one stroke sent the head rolling from the body. Chapter 5. From beyond the Don, from the upper reaches, from all districts, came reports of the extensive scope of the rising. 7 districts had revolted, and had hastily assembled companies. 3 other districts were openly ready to come over. Vyashenska became the center of the revolt. After long argument and discussion, it was decided to retain the previous form of government. The Cossacks commanding most respect, chiefly younger men, were elected to the regional executive committee. Danilov, a former artillery officer, was elected chairman. Soviets were formed in the districts and villages, and, strange to relate, even the once reviled word comrade remained in everyday intercourse. The slogan was raised, "For the Soviet regime, but against the communes, shootings, and pillaging." Instead of the white cockade or ribbon round the cap, the insurgents wore a white and a red ribbon crossed. The officers elected to lead the rising came straight from the Cossack ranks, but they could only confirm that which the companies had already accomplished. As organizers and leaders, their hands were tied, nor were they strong enough to direct such chaff or to keep pace with the swift movement of events. A red cavalry regiment was dispatched against the rising, and gathering the Bolsheviks of Ust-Kharpetsk, Yalansk, and parts of the Vyashenska districts as it marched, it fought its way through village after village, moving over the steppe westward along the Don. On March 18th, the Cossack galloped into Tatarsk with an urgent appeal for help to be sent to the Yalanska insurgents. They had retreated without resisting, for they had no rifles or ammunition. The Reds had swept them with machine-gun bullets. 2 batteries had opened fire on them. In such circumstances it was hopeless to wait for instructions from the district center, so Pyotr Melyukhov decided to advance against the Reds with his 2 squadrons. He took over command of the 4 squadrons assembled by neighboring villages, and in the morning led his Cossacks out of Tatarsk, sending patrols on ahead. Some 6 miles outside the village, at the spot where Gregor and his wife Natalia had plowed and had been overtaken by the first snow of winter, the spot where he had first confessed to her that he did not love her, the cavalry dismounted and spread into a line, the horses being led off under cover. Below them they could see the Reds marching in 3 lines out of a spacious valley. The enemy were still some 2 miles away, and the Cossacks unhurriedly made ready for the battle. Pyotr trotted up on his well-fed, steaming horse to where Gregor was in charge of a half-squadron. He was cheerful and animated. "Brothers, don't waste your bullets. Fire when I give the command. Gregor, lead your half-squadron some 50 yards more to the left." He gave a few final orders, then raised his field glasses to his eyes. "Why, they're setting up a battery on Matveyev Mound," he exclaimed. "I saw that some time ago. You don't need glasses to see it," Gregor remarked. He took the field glasses from his brother's hand and gazed. "Pyotr, come over here," he asked, stepping a little away from the line of men. Pyotr followed him. Frowning with obvious discontent, Gregor said, "I don't like this position. We ought to get away from these gullies. They may attack us on the flank. And then where should we be? What do you think?" "What's the matter with you?" Pyotr angrily waved his hand. "How can they attack us on the flank? I'm holding one company in reserve, and in the worst case the gullies will be of value to us. They're no danger." "You watch out, my boy," Griegor warned him. After casting another swift glance around the position, he went back to his Cossacks. Despite strict orders to the contrary, the Tatarsk infantry, dancers, as the horsemen jestingly called them, had gathered into little groups, dividing up bullets, smoking, and laughing. Kristonia's fur cap rose a head above the rest, and Panteleimon Melyakov's red three-cornered cap was clearly visible. The majority of them were old men and youngsters. The Yelansk men were drawn up about half a mile or so away. There were 600 men in their 4 companies, but almost 200 of them had been told off to mind horses. The talk died down as soon as the field guns of the battery behind the mound began to fire. The heavy booming sound hung long over the steppe. The first shell was badly aimed and fell nearly half a mile short of the Cossack lines. The black smoke of the explosion crumbled and clung to the bushes. Machine guns began to cough from the red lines. The frost muffled the fullness of their sound, and they knocked like a night watchman's hammer. The Cossacks lay down in the snow behind the bushes and among the brushy, headless sunflower stalks. "That smoke's pretty black. It looks as though they're using German shells," Prokhor Zhykov shouted across to Griegor. A red-bearded company commander from Rubyezhin village came running to Pyotr. "I've got an idea, Comrade Melyakov," he said. "Send one of the squadrons down to the Don and let them pass along the bank to the village and strike the Reds from the rear. They're sure to have left their baggage sledges undefended, and it'll put them in a panic." Pyotr approved of the idea. He strode across to Griegor, explained what was proposed, and curtly ordered him, "You withdraw your half-squadron and strike at their tail." Griegor withdrew his Cossacks, mounted them in a gully, and led them at a swift trot towards the village. The Cossacks in position fired 2 rounds, and then were silent. The red line lay down. One of the bullets from their machine guns struck Martin Shamil's horse, and it tore itself out of the hand of the Cossack guarding it, galloped frantically through the line of Rubyezhin Cossacks, and sped down the hill towards the Reds. A stream of machine guns swept across it, and the animal's hindquarters leaped high into the air before it crashed to the snow. Pyotr gave orders to fire at the machine gunners. One little Cossack, famous for his marksmanship, picked off 3 gunners, and the Maxim was put out of action. But reserve gunners quickly took their places, and the gun was soon sowing its seed of death once more. The Cossacks buried themselves deeper and deeper in the snow until they reached the bare earth. Evidently the Red batteries were short of ammunition, for after some 30 rounds they ceased fire. Pyotr impatiently glanced back to the top of the hill and sent 2 couriers into the village with orders for all the adult population to come out, armed with forks, scythes, and axes. He hoped that their appearance on the hill would impress the Reds with an exaggerated idea of the Cossacks' strength. In response to the command, crowds of people soon appeared on the brow of the hill and poured down the slope. The Cossacks greeted them with jests. "Look at those black stones rolling down. All the village has turned out, women and all. Pity the Red batteries have stopped firing," remarked armless Alexei. "If they were to send 1 shell among that lot, they'd be running back to the village with wet skirts." Apparently, he seriously regretted that the Reds did not fire a single shell at the women. The crowd drew up in 2 long, irregular lines and halted. Pyotr ordered them to keep well behind the Cossack lines, but their very appearance must have impressed the Reds, for they began to retreat, dropping down to the bottom of the valley. After a brief conference with his company commanders, Pyotr laid bare his right flank by withdrawing 2 lines of Yelansk men, ordering them to ride to the north to support Griegor's attack. In full view of the Reds, the squadrons formed and rode down towards the Don. The Cossacks renewed their fire on the retreating enemy. Meantime, several of the more desperate women and a swarm of lads had penetrated into the ranks of the fighting line. Darya was among them. She went up to Pyotr and asked, "Pyotr, let me have a shot at the Reds. I know how to handle a rifle." She took Pyotr's carbine and, kneeling down, confidently set the barrel against her shoulder and fired a couple of shots. The reserves on the hillside began to stamp their feet and jump to keep themselves warm, and the two lines shook as though swayed by the wind. The women's cheeks and lips went blue. The frost quickly penetrated beneath the broad hems of their skirts. Many of them, old Grishaka among them, had to be helped by the arm up the hill. Yet they kept up an excited conversation as they told of the exploits of former wars and battles, and of the misery of the present war, in which brother was fighting brother, father against son, and the cannon fired from so far away that they could not be seen with the naked eye. With his half-squadron, Griagor struck at the baggage sledges, killed 8 Red Guards, and captured 4 sledges laden with ammunition and 2 saddle horses. He lost 1 horse, and 1 Cossack suffered the merest scratch. But while Griagor was retreating along the Don with the captured sledges, completely unmolested and rejoicing at his success, the struggle had come to an end on the hill above Tatarsk. Before the beginning of the battle, a squadron of Red cavalry had set out on a 7-mile march to outflank the Cossacks, and suddenly appearing around the hill, they fell upon the men minding the horses. A panic set in, and the Cossacks fled with the horses out of the gully. Some of them succeeded in leading the mounts back to the lines, but most of them were cut down by the Red cavalry or ran in confusion to escape. The infantry were unable to fire for fear of hitting their own men, and they poured down into the gully like peas out of a sack, taking to disorderly flight. Those of the Cossack cavalry who succeeded in catching horses, and they were the majority, vied with one another in a headlong race back to the village. As soon as Pyotr heard the shout and realized what had happened, he commanded, "To horse! Latishev, take the infantry across the gully!" But he failed to reach his own horse. The youngster who had charge of it came galloping towards him, leading his and Fyodor Badovskov's mounts, but a Red Army man behind him pounded and slashed at his shoulder. Fortunately, a rifle was hanging at the lad's back, and instead of cutting him down, the sword slipped against the rifle barrel and flew out of the man's hand. But the youngster's horse turned aside and galloped off, and Pyotr and Fyodor's horses followed it. Pyotr groaned and stood for a moment, white-faced, the sweat pouring down his cheeks. He looked back. Some dozen Cossacks were running towards him. "We're lost!" Badovskov shouted, his face distorted with terror. "Down into the gully, Cossacks! Brothers, into the gully!" Pyotr mastered himself, led them at a run to the edge, and rolled helter-skelter down the steep slope. At the bottom he jumped up and shook himself like a dog, with all his body at once. 10 Cossacks tumbled down behind him. At the top, shots were still ringing out. Shouts and the trample of hoofs were to be heard. In the gully bottom, the Cossacks brushed the snow and sand from their caps, or rubbed sore spots. Martin Shamil set to work to free his rifle barrel of snow. Only young Manitskov, the son of the former ataman, trembled with fear, and tears ran down his cheeks. "What are we to do?" he howled. "Pyotr, tell us. Death is right ahead of us. Where shall we go? They'll kill us." Fyodor Badovskov turned and ran along the bottom of the gully towards the Don. The others followed him like sheep. Pyotr brought them to a halt. "Stop! Don't run away! I'll shoot!" He led them under the overhanging brow of the cliff and proposed, stammering but endeavoring to maintain at least a semblance of calm, "You can't get out at the bottom. They're sure to be chasing our men. We must hide in the gully. Some of us on the other side. We must hold this spot. We can stand a siege here. We're lost. Fathers, brothers, let me get out of here. I don't want to die." The younger Manitskov burst into a weeping wail. Badovskov's Kalmyk eyes flashed, and he smashed his fist into the lad's face, bringing the blood streaming from his nose and sending his body crashing against the wall of the cliff. But the boy ceased to whine. "How can we fire at them?" Martin Shamil asked, seizing Pyotr by the arm. "We haven't any bullets, and they'll bomb us out with hand grenades." "Well, what else are we to do?" Pyotr turned suddenly blue, and his lips foamed. "Lie down! Am I commander or not? I'll kill you!" He waved his revolver over their heads. His whistling whisper seemed to put new life into them. Bodovskov, Martin Shamil, and 2 other Cossacks ran to the other side of the gully and lay down under the cliff. The others remained with Pyotr. In springtime, the rushing flood of hill water sends the stones rolling down and washes away the bottom of the gully, eating into the layers of red clay and cutting holes and passages in the walls of the cliff. And in these holes the Cossacks hid themselves. Above them they heard the sound of running feet, and snow and sand sprinkled down into the gully. "There they are," Pyotr muttered. No one approached close to the edge, but the Cossacks heard the sound of voices and someone shouting at a horse. "Talking over how to get at us," Pyotr thought, and again the sweat poured down his back and over his chest and face. There was a shout from above them. "Hey, you! Come on out! We'll kill you in any case!" Snow fell thickly in a milky white stream into the gully. Evidently someone was coming close to the edge. Another voice remarked confidently, "They jumped down there. Here are their footmarks, and I saw them myself. Pyotr Melyakov, come out of there!" For a moment Pyotr was gripped with a blind joy. "Who is there among the Reds who knows me? They must be our own Cossacks. They've driven them off," he thought. But next moment the same voice made him shiver. "It's Mikhail Sholokhov speaking. We call on you to surrender. In any case, you won't get out." Pyotr wiped his damp brow, and streaks of bloody sweat were left on his palm. Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Pyotr wiped his damp brow, and streaks of bloody sweat were left on his palm. A strange feeling of equanimity, almost of oblivion, crept over him, and very distant seemed Antip's shout, "We'll come out if you'll let us go. If not, we shall shoot." "We'll let you go," the reply came from above after a momentary silence. With a terrible effort, Pyotr shook off his lethargy. He thought he had detected a sneer in the words, "let you go." He hoarsely shouted, "Back!" but no one listened to him. He was the last to emerge. Within him, like a babe below a woman's heart, life was stirring powerfully. Dominated by the instinct for self-preservation, he removed the bullets from his rifle magazine before he climbed up the steep wall. His eyes were muddy. His heart filled all his breast. He was choking like a child in heavy sleep. He tore his collar open. His eyes were filled with sweat. His hands slipped over the cold slope of the cliff. Panting, he clambered to the spot where they were standing, threw his rifle down at his feet, and raised his hands above his head. The Cossacks who had come out before him were huddled close together. Mishka Koshevoy stepped out of the group of red foot and horse soldiers and strode towards them. He went up to Pyotr and, standing right in front of him, his eyes fixed on the ground, asked quietly, "Had enough of fighting?" He waited a moment for an answer, then, staring at Pyotr's feet, asked in the same tone, "You were in command of them, weren't you?" Pyotr's lips quivered. With a gesture of terrible weariness, with great difficulty, he raised his hand to his wet brow. Mishka's long eyelashes flickered, his swollen upper lip curled upward. His body was shaken with such a violent shudder that it seemed he would not be able to keep his feet. But he at once raised his eyes to Pyotr's, gazed straight into his pupils, piercing them with a strangely alien gaze, and muttered hurriedly, "Undress." Pyotr quickly threw off his sheepskin jacket, carefully rolled it up, and laid it on the snow. He removed his cap, his belt, his khaki shirt, and, sitting on the edge of his jacket, began to pull off his boots, momentarily turning paler. "Don't take off your shirt," Mishka whispered, and, shuddering, abruptly shouted, "Quicker, you!" Ivan Alexeyevich dismounted and came across to them, gritting his teeth and fearful of bursting into tears. Hardly moving his lips, Pyotr called to him, "Cousin!" Ivan stood watching silently as the snow melted beneath Pyotr's bare feet. "Cousin Ivan, you were the godfather of my child. Cousin, don't shoot me," Pyotr pleaded. Seeing Mishka had already raised his revolver to the level of his chest, he dilated his eyes as though guarding against a dazzling flash, hurriedly set his fingers ready to cross himself, and buried his head on his breast. He did not hear the shot. He fell headlong, as though struck violently from behind. Koshevoy's outstretched hand seized him above the heart and squeezed the blood from him. With his last earthly effort, Pyotr threw open the collar of his shirt and lay bare the bullet hole beneath his left nipple. At first the blood oozed slowly from the wound, then, finding vent, it spurted up in a thick, dark stream. At dusk, a reconnaissance party sent out from Tatarsk returned with the news that they had found no trace of the Reds, but that Pyotr Melikhov and 10 other Cossacks were lying dead on the steppe. Griagor arranged for sledges to bring in the bodies. Then, driven out of his own home by the women's lamentations over the dead Pyotr and the dull misery in Darya's voice, he went to spend the night with Kristonia. Until dawn he sat by the stove in Kristonia's hut, smoking cigarette after cigarette, and carrying on an aimless conversation with the drowsy Kristonia, as though afraid of being left face to face with his own thoughts, with his yearning for his brother. Day broke. A thaw set in early in the morning. By 10 o'clock, puddles were appearing in the dung-littered road. A cock crowed as if it were springtime, and a hen clucked away as at a sultry noontide. On the sunny side of the yards, the cattle huddled and rubbed against the fences. The melting snow smelled damp and rotten. A tiny yellow-breasted tomtit was swinging and chattering on a bare bough of the apple tree standing by Kristonia's gate. As Griagor stood at the gate awaiting the arrival of the sledges, he involuntarily translated the tomtit's chatter into the language of his childhood. "Sharpen plough," the tit called joyously this melting morning. But if it were to turn frosty, Griagor knew that its voice would change, and the tit would hurriedly counsel, "Put on your boots, put on your boots." He turned his eyes from the road to the swaying tit. Sharpen plough," it chattered blithely. As he listened, Griagor recalled how, when they were children, he and Pyotr had driven the turkeys out to feed in the steppe, and Pyotr had cleverly imitated the turkey's gobble and had translated it into child talk. Griagor had laughed happily and asked his brother to talk again like a turkey. At the end of the street a sledge appeared, a Cossack walking beside it. Then a second and a third came into sight. Griagor brushed away his tear and the quiet smile aroused by the uninvited memory, and hurriedly went towards his own gate. His mother was half-crazed with grief, and at that first terrible moment he wanted to keep her away from the sledge carrying Pyotr's body. It was Alexei Shamil, striding along bareheaded beside the first sledge. With the stump of his left arm, he was pressing his cap to his breast. In his right hand he was holding the reins. Griagor glanced into the sledge. Martin Shamil was lying face upward on the straw, his face and tunic stained with congealed blood. Manitskov was in the second sledge, his gashed face thrust into the straw, his head huddled on his shoulders, the cranium slashed away by a clean and dexterous stroke. Griagor glanced into the third sledge, but he was unable to recognize the dead body. He seized the bridle of the fourth horse and led it into his yard. Behind it ran the neighbors, women and children. The crowd gathered around the steps. "There lies our dear Pyotr Panteleiev. He's gone from us," someone quietly said. Stepan Astachov came bareheaded through the gate. Grishacha and 3 other old men appeared from somewhere. Griagor glanced around distractedly. "Help me carry him into the hut," he asked. The driver was about to pick up Pyotr by his feet, but the crowd silently and respectfully opened a path for Ilinichna as she came down the steps. She stared at the sledge. A deathly pallor hung on her brow and covered her cheeks, her nose, creeping down to her chin. Panteleimon, silently trembling, held her under the arm. Dunya was the first to lift up her voice. Then Darya, disheveled, her face swollen with weeping, ran down the steps and threw herself into the sledge. "Pyotr, my dear, dear Pyotr, stand up, stand up!" Gregor's eyes were somber. "Go away, Darya!" he shouted savagely, uncontrollably, and violently pushed her off. She fell into a snowdrift. Gregor swiftly raised Pyotr under the arms. The driver held his bare feet. But Darya crawled on all fours after them up the steps, kissing, clutching at her husband's inflexible, frozen hands. Feeling that in another moment he would completely lose control of himself, Gregor thrust her off with his foot. Dunya forcibly tore away Darya's hands and pressed her swooning head against her breast. The kitchen was desolately silent. Terribly small, as though he had shrunk, Pyotr lay on the floor. His nose was pinched, his flaxen whiskers had darkened, but all his face had drawn taut and grown finer. His bare, hairy feet emerged from his trouser legs. He was slowly melting, and under him was a little pool of rosy water. The more the frozen body thawed, the stronger became the salty scent of blood and the cloyingly sweet smell of decay. Under the shed, Panteleimon was making a coffin. The women were still occupied with Darya, who had not recovered consciousness. From time to time a piercing, hysterical shriek came from her room, followed by the lower tones of Auntie Vasilisa, who had run to share the Melyakovs' grief. Gregor sat on a bench, staring at his brother's yellowing face, at his hand with its round blue nails. A terrible chill of alienation already severed him from Pyotr. He was no longer his brother, but a transient guest who had now to depart. He lay with his cheek unconcernedly pressed against the earthen floor, a tranquil, mysterious little smile frozen under his mustache. And tomorrow his wife and mother would be making him ready for his last journey. "Better that you should have died somewhere in Prussia than here under your mother's eyes," Gregor slowly, reproachfully told him. Glancing at the body, he turned suddenly pale. Over Pyotr's cheek a tear was slipping. Gregor jumped across to him, but, gazing more attentively, he sighed with relief. It was not a dead tear, but a drop melting out of Pyotr's hair that had fallen onto his brow and was slowly trickling down the cheek. In the evening his mother heated 3 pitchers of warm water for him, and his wife prepared clean linen, his best trousers, and his uniform tunic. Gregor and Panteleimon washed the body, that no longer belonged to Pyotr, that felt no shame for its nakedness. Then they dressed him in his Sunday best and laid him out on the table. Darya came. Into his broad, icy hands, which only yesterday had embraced her, she put the candle that had lighted them both as they had walked behind the priest around the church lectern on their wedding day. Cossack Pyotr Melyakov was ready to be conducted to that place whence there is no returning to native habitations. Chapter 6. By order of Kudinov, commander of the combined insurgent forces, Gregor Melyakov was appointed commander of the Vyazhenska regiment, consisting of 10 squadrons of Cossacks. The staff at Vyazhenska gave him instructions to march in the direction of Kargin district, to shatter Likhachev's detachment at any cost, and to drive it beyond the bounds of the region. The day he took command of the regiment, he reviewed his Cossacks as they rode out of Vyazhenska. He sat bowed in his saddle, his horse reined in tightly at the roadside, while past him in column formation rode squadrons drawn from the Donside villages. Bazka, Bielogorka, Olshanska, Merkolov, Gromkov, Semyonovsky, Rybinsk, Vodchinsk, Lyabazhi, and Yerik. With one gloved hand he stroked his mustache as he inspected each squadron with grim, watchful eyes. Rings of tobacco smoke floated and dissolved above the ranks, and steam rose from the horses. When the regiment was some 3 miles outside Vyashenska, a patrol returned to report that the Reds were retreating in the direction of Chukharin. Griagor dispatched 3 squadrons to outflank the enemy detachment, and with the remainder rode so hard on their heels that the Reds began to abandon their baggage train and ammunition chests. As the Likhachev battery was driving out of Chukharin, it lost some of its guns in a little stream. The drivers cut the traces and galloped off. The Cossacks rode 12 miles beyond Chukharin towards Kargin without encountering opposition, and they began to talk of reaching Novocherkass. Griagor was delighted with the captured battery. They didn't even stop to spike the guns, he thought contemptuously. With the help of bullocks, the Cossacks hauled the battery out of the stream. Gunners were at once forthcoming from the various squadrons. Double sets of horses, 6 pairs to each gun, were harnessed to the limbers, and a half-squadron was assigned as guard. The Cossacks took Kargin at dusk. Part of the Likhachev detachment, together with the remaining 3 field guns and 9 machine guns, were captured. The others managed to escape northward. Rain fell all night, and in the morning the gullies and ravines were running with water. The roads became almost impassable. The horses floundered in the melting snow and mud. The men dropped with weariness. 2 squadrons sent to pursue the retreating enemy captured some 30 of the Reds in the morning and brought them back to Kargin. Griagor had established his headquarters in the large house of a local merchant. The prisoners were driven into the yard. The commander of the 2 squadrons reported to Griagor, 27 Reds taken. What's to be done with them? Griagor seized him by the top button of his greatcoat and bent close to his ear. Little sparks glittered in his eyes, but beneath his whiskers his lips were smiling with a wolfish smile. Send them under escort to Vyashenska. You understand? But they are not to get farther than the other side of that rise. He waved his whip in the direction of the sandy slope rising above Kargin. That's the first step towards settling accounts for Pyotr, he thought. Out of Kargin, Griagor led 3,500 swordsmen. The Vyashenska General Staff and the Executive Committee sent urgent commands and instructions after him, ordering him to march on and forbidding the killing of prisoners. One of the members of the committee wrote to him privately in a flowery epistle, "Highly respected Comrade Melyakov, rumors are coming to our ears that you are ruthlessly executing the Red Army prisoners. We hear that among the prisoners was a woman communist who might have been very useful to us in learning the strength of the enemy. Dear comrade, repeal your order, which is dangerous to us. The Cossacks are murmuring at such ruthlessness, and are afraid that the Reds will kill their prisoners too, and destroy our villages. You are marching on with your companies like Taras Bulba in the historical novel of the writer Pushkin, putting everything to fire and sword, and upsetting the Cossacks. Please do not condemn the prisoners to death, but send them to us. In that will be our strength. With all good wishes for your health, we send you hearty greeting and await your further success." For 3 days success attended Griagor. He captured Bukovsky by storm and led his troops on towards Krasnokutsk. A small detachment barring the way was taken prisoner, but he did not give orders for the prisoners to be killed. He sent them back to Vyashenska. Afraid of this sudden threat to their rear, the command of the Red Front on the Donets River dispatched several regiments and batteries to deal with the rising. The Red reinforcements came into conflict with Griagor's regiments close to Krystyakov. The struggle lasted for 3 hours. Then, afraid of being surrounded, Griagor withdrew his forces towards Krasnokutsk. But the next morning his regiments were attacked by a force of Red Cossacks from Khopyersk, and Don Cossacks were once more sabering one another in great style. Griagor himself lost his horse and was wounded in the cheek. He withdrew his regiments from the engagement and retreated to Bukovsky. The same evening, wishing to obtain more information about the enemy, he questioned a prisoner, a Cossack from Khopyersk district. The man replied willingly, but with a forced and crooked smile. "What reserves of ammunition have your forces got?" Griagor demanded. "The devil knows how much. And guns? 8 at least. Where was your regiment raised? From the Kamensky villages. What did the Cossacks say when they were mobilized? They didn't want to go. Did you know why we have risen? How should we know? Then why didn't you want to go? Well, aren't you Cossacks like us? Haven't we had enough war already? Would you be willing to serve with us? As you will, but I don't want to. Griegor stared with knitted brows after the man as he was led out of the room, then summoned his orderly, Prokhor Zhykov. He went across to the window and, standing with his back to Prokhor, calmly ordered him, "Tell the boys to take that man I've just been examining and lead him quietly into the garden. I won't take Red Cossack prisoners." He turned and gazed out of the window. Prokhor went out. For a minute or two, Griegor stood idly snapping the twigs of a geranium on the window ledge. Then he turned and went swiftly out on the steps. He saw Prokhor Zhykov talking quietly to a group of Cossacks sitting in the sun under the granary wall. "Let the prisoner go. Write him out a pass," he called to Prokhor, without looking at the Cossacks. He returned to the room, halted before an old mirror, and stretched out his arms in astonishment, at a loss to know why he had gone out and given this order for the prisoner to be released. He was a little irritated with himself for his sudden tender-heartedness, yet he was glad. It was all the more strange, since only the previous day he had told the Cossacks, "The peasant is an enemy, but a Cossack who helps the Reds is doubly an enemy. There must be as short shrift for a Cossack as for a spy, against the wall and through the heavenly gates for him." He went out into the yard. The sun was shining warmly. The sky was as distant as in midsummer, and of a midsummer azure, with little white clouds floating over it from the south. At a corner he assembled all the squadron commanders to hold a council of war. Some 30 men gathered and seated themselves on a fallen fence. Someone's tobacco pouch was passed from hand to hand. "What plans shall we make?" Griegor opened the council. "How are we to deal with these regiments that have driven us back, and what road shall we take?" "How many are there against us? Did you find out from the prisoner?" one of the squadron commanders asked after a pause. Griegor specified the regiments, and hurriedly estimated the probable number enrolled in them. The commanders sat silent, none of them willing to speak without careful consideration. One openly told Griegor so. "Wait a bit, Milyakov, let's think. We mustn't make any mistake here." After a while they began to express their opinions. The majority of them declared themselves against going far, even if they were successful, but wanted to maintain a purely defensive struggle. But one of them hotly supported the order of the Vishenska staff to march on. "There's no point in our marking time here," he argued. "Let Milyakov lead us to the Donets. We're only a handful, and behind them is all Russia. How can we stand still? They'll drive us back, and then we're done for. We must break through. We haven't got much ammunition, but we'll capture more. We must make a raid." "And what about our people? The women, the old men and children?" "Let them stay behind. You think you're clever, but you're a fool." Hitherto the commanders had only whispered their fears concerning the spring plowing and what would happen to their farms if they tried to break through. But now all the men from Chirik began to bawl at the top of their voices. The conference at once began to sound like a village assembly. One elderly Cossack outshouted the rest. "We won't leave our yards. I shall be the first to lead my company back to its village. If we must fight, let it be around our huts and not to save others' lives." Griegor waited until silence fell, then gave his decisive vote. "We shall hold the front here. If the Krasnokutsk Cossacks join us, we'll defend them too. There's nowhere we can go to. The council is ended. To your squadrons. We shall be going out to our positions at once." As half an hour later he watched the dense lines of horsemen winding endlessly along the streets, Griegor felt a sharp, proud joy. But together with his self-satisfied joy, anxiety and a caustic bitterness stirred within him. Could he lead them as they needed to be led? Would he have the intelligence to direct the activities of thousands of Cossacks? Not one squadron, but an entire division was now at his disposition. And was he, a poorly educated Cossack, to hold sway over thousands of lives and bear Christian responsibility for them? But most of all, he thought, who am I leading them against? Against the people. Who is right? Lord, what a life! Grinding his teeth, he rode along beside the closed ranks of the squadrons. The intoxicating strength of power faded from his eyes, and the anxiety and bitterness remained, bowing his shoulders with their unbearable weight. Chapter 7. Spring opened the veins of the rivers. More sappy grew the days, more turbulent the green hill torrents. The sun grew perceptibly redder. The impotent yellow hue faded from it. The spokes of the sun rays became velvety and hot. At noontide the plowed land streamed, and the pitted, scaly snow glittered unbearably. Saturated with moisture, the air was heavy and scented. The sun warmed Gregor's back. It warmed all the men of the regiments. The saddle seats were pleasantly warm. The brown Cossack cheeks were moistened by a rough, stinging wind. Occasionally it brought a breath of cold from a snowy slope, but the warmth was overcoming the winter. The horses danced and pranced in the grip of the spring. The molting hair sprinkled from them, and their sweat pricked more strongly in the nostrils. The Cossacks had already tied up their horses' bushy tails. Already the cowls of camel hair hung unwanted on the riders' backs. Under the fur caps their brows were wet, and it was hot in their sheepskin jackets and padded coats. Gregor led the regiments along a summer track. Squadrons of Reds were visible in the distance beyond a windmill. The struggle began close to the village of Svridov. Gregor was not yet able to direct a battle from outside the ranks of the fighters, as a divisional commander should. He himself led the Vyashenska Cossacks into the struggle, throwing them into the most dangerous spots. The battle developed without any unified direction. Each regiment ignored any agreement they had previously reached, and acted without regard to the course of the general situation. There was no front in the usual sense of the word, and so it was possible to resort to extensive maneuvering. An abundance of cavalry, which was the predominating force in Gregor's division, was an important asset. Gregor decided to exploit this advantage to the full, and to carry on the war by Cossack methods: attacks on the flanks, sorties to the enemy's rear, threats to the baggage trains, and alarming and demoralizing the Reds with night raids. But near Svididov he resolved on a different plan. He himself led the squadrons at a fast trot into the attack, leaving one squadron dismounted and lying in ambush in the orchards on the outskirts of the village. Opposed to him were more than 2 squadrons of Red cavalry. They were not Kharpersk Cossacks, for through his field glasses he could see the docked tails of their horses, and the Don Cossacks never marred the beauty of their horses by docking their tails. From the top of a rise he examined the locality through his glasses. From the saddle the land always seemed more spacious, and he felt more sure of himself when the toes of his boots were resting in the stirrups. A good mile separated him from the lines of Reds preparing to attack. He hurriedly drew up his regiments according to the old military plan, setting those armed with lances in the leading rank. He galloped to the front, turned his horse sideways to the Cossacks, and drew his sword. At an easy trot, forward! During the very first minute of the advance, Gregor's horse put its hoof into a marmot hole hidden under the snow, and it stumbled beneath him. He paled with anger, and struck it violently with the flat of his sword. The horse was a good one, a fiery army mount borrowed from a Vyashenska Cossack, but he felt distrustful of it. He knew that a couple of days was not long enough for the horse to become accustomed to him, nor had he had time to learn its character and tricks. He was afraid his new mount would not understand his use of the reins, nor obey his command almost before he spoke, as his own horse, killed at Kristyakov, had understood and obeyed. The blow from the sword excited the animal, and it broke into a gallop, taking no heed of the reins. Gregor turned cold and even lost a little of his self-control. But as it dropped into a long, swinging canter, yielding more and more to the hardly perceptible movement of his hands directing its course, he grew more confident and cool. He dropped his eyes for a moment from the advancing ranks of the enemy and glanced over his horse's neck. Its red ears were pressed evilly against its head. Its outstretched neck was quivering rhythmically. Gregor straightened up in the saddle, greedily gulped in the air, and thrust his boots far into the stirrups. He looked back. How many times had he seen behind him that thundering avalanche of horses and riders, and each time his heart had been gripped with fear of the impending clash, and he had felt an inexplicable feeling of savage agitation. From the moment when he put his horse into motion to the moment when he was approaching the enemy, there was always an intangible second of inward transformation. Reason, coolness, calculation, all abandoned him in that terrible instant, and one bestial instinct masterfully and indivisibly entered upon the government of his will. Yet anyone watching him at the moment of attack would have thought that his movements were directed by a cold, unemotional reason, so assured, controlled, and calculating did he seem. The distance between the two forces decreased with consoling swiftness. Gregor picked out one rider galloping some 3 lengths in advance of his squadron. The great dark bay horse under him was moving with a short wolfish stride. The man was waving an officer's sword in the air. His silver scabbard swung and knocked against his stirrup and gleamed fierily in the sun. A moment later, Gregor was able to recognize the man as a Kargin communist who had been among the first to return, a young 25-year-old lad, from the German War in 1917. He had brought back with him Bolshevik convictions and a hard energy born of life at the front. He had remained a Bolshevik, had served in the Red Army, and before the Rising broke out had returned from his regiment to organize the Soviet regime in his district. Now, confidently guiding his horse, picturesquely brandishing a sword which was of no value except on the parade ground, he was galloping straight towards Gregor. Gregor bared his teeth and raised the reins. The horse obediently increased its speed. Gregor had a trick of his own which he habitually employed in an attack. In childhood he had been left-handed. Even if he picked up his spoon with his right hand, he would at once pass it into his left. His father had beaten him cruelly again and again to knock the habit out of him, and even the other boys had called him Lefty Gregor. The beatings and cursings must have had their effect upon him, for when he was about 10 years of age he had lost the trick of using only his left hand, but he had retained his left-handed dexterity and could do everything with it as well as with his right. While attacking, he always made use of his skill with the left hand with invariable success. He would guide his horse against the selected enemy horseman, moving over to the left as usual in order to strike with the right hand, while his enemy did the same. When perhaps some 20 yards separated them, and the other man was already leaning slightly to one side with sword ready to strike, Gregor would swing his horse sharply to the right, at the same time transferring his sword to his left hand. Being placed at a disadvantage by the necessity of striking at him across his own horse's head, the enemy would be nonplussed and disconcerted, and Gregor would bring his sword down with terrible force on the helpless man. As a switch, cut expertly slantwise from a bush, drops without a tremor, without changing its position, and falls point downward into the sand beside the bush from which the Cossack sword has cut it, so the handsome Semiglasov fell from his rearing horse and quietly slipped out of the saddle, his palms pressed against his sabred breast. Gregor at once straightened up in the saddle and stood in the stirrups. A second man came blindly at him, unable to rein in his horse. Beyond the animal's foaming muzzle, Gregor was not yet able to see the rider, but he could see the curved blade of the man's sword. He pulled with all his strength on the reins, and accepted and replied to the blow, gathering the reins in his right hand, and cutting at the clean-shaven crimson neck. He was the first to fight his way through and gallop clear of the mingled crowd of Cossacks and Reds. Looking back, he saw a seething mass of cavalry. He thrust his sword into its scabbard, pulled out his pistol, and sent his horse galloping off at full speed. The Cossacks streamed after him in a scattered line. At his side a sergeant in a fox-skin cap and sheepskin jacket was galloping. The man's ear and cheek had been slashed to the very chin, and his breast looked as though a basket of ripe cherries had been crushed against it. His teeth were bared and bloody. The Red Army men, wavering and already half in flight, turned their horses, encouraged to take up the pursuit of the retreating Cossacks. One lagging Cossack was swept from his horse as though by the wind, and trampled into the snow by the horse's hoofs. Now the village, the black mass of orchards, the shrine on the hillside, the broad street were at hand. Not more than 200 yards away was the fence of the enclosure where the Cossack company lay in ambush. In full gallop, Gregor shouted to the Cossack cavalry behind him, "Open rank!" The solid stream of Cossack squadrons split into two streams, like the current of a river against a boulder. The avalanche of Red Army cavalry was laid bare. A volley rang out from the company concealed behind the fence, then a second, a third. A horse went down headlong with its Red Army rider. Another crumpled at the knees and buried its head in the snow. 3 or 4 other Reds were bowled out of their saddles. Before the Red cavalry could rein in their horses and turn round, the Cossacks had discharged all the contents of their rifle magazines and were silent. Hardly had Gregor succeeded in roaring, "Squadrons!" when the 1,000 horses' hooves swung sharply round in the snow, and the Cossacks were in pursuit. But they followed the Reds reluctantly. Their horses were tired, and after a mile the Cossacks turned back. They undressed the dead Red Army men and unsaddled their horses. Armless Alexei Shamil himself killed off 3 wounded Reds, standing them with their faces to the fence and cutting them down one after another. When he had finished, the Cossacks, cigarettes in their mouths, crowded around the bodies. All 3 bore the same mark. Their trunks were cloven from clavicle to waist. "I've turned 3 into 6, Alexei boasted, his eyes and cheek twitching. The other Cossacks fawningly treated him to tobacco, staring with undisguised respect at his small fist and the swelling chest muscles visible through his open jacket. The sweating horses stood trembling by the fence, with great coats flung over their backs. The Cossacks tightened the saddle girths and stood in turn for water at the well. Many had to drag their wearied horses by the reins. Gregor rode forward with Prokhor and 5 Cossacks. His eyes were as though a bandage had fallen from them. Again, as before the attack, he saw the sun shining over the earth, and the melting snow lying under the straw ricks. He heard the merry chatter of the sparrows in the village, caught the finest scents of the spring standing at the threshold. Life had returned to him, not faded, not grown old with the blood so recently shed, but still more enticing with its meager and illusory joys. The remnants of snow left on the black ground of the melting earth always seemed delusively whiter and brighter. Chapter 8. Like floodwater, the rising swelled and spread, inundating all the Donside districts and the steppe to the east of the Don for 300 miles around. 25,000 Cossacks took to horse. 10,000 infantry were supplied by the villages of the upper Don region. The war was waged in unprecedented conditions. Along the Donets, the Don White Army was holding the front, covering Novocherkass, and preparing for a decisive struggle. And in the rear of the 8th and 9th Red Armies opposing the White forces, a rising was storming, infinitely complicating the already difficult task of mastering the Don area. The insurgent Cossacks suffered from a shortage of military equipment. At first there was an insufficiency of rifles, later of bullets. They had to be won at the cost of blood through attacks or night raids, and they were won. In April 1919, the insurgents were completely equipped with rifles and had 8 batteries and 150 machine guns. At the beginning of the rising, there were 5 million blank cartridges in the warehouse at Vyazhenska. The regional Soviet mobilized all the finest blacksmiths, locksmiths, and gunsmiths, and a workshop for the casting of bullets was organized. But there was no lead and nothing from which to cast the bullets. Then, at the call of the regional Soviet, all the villages began to collect their reserves of lead and copper. All the leaden parts in the steam mills were requisitioned, and a brief appeal was carried to the villagers by mounted couriers. Your husbands, sons, and brothers have nothing to shoot from their rifles. They are firing only with what they can win from the accursed enemy. Hand over all you have suitable for casting bullets. Take the leaden sieves from the winnowing machines. Within a week, not one winnowing machine throughout the entire district was left with a sieve. The women carried everything of use and of no use into the village Soviets. The lads of the villages where battles had occurred dug the shot out of the walls and rummaged in the ground in search of pieces of shell. But even in this activity there was not complete unity. Certain of the poorer women who did not wish to deprive themselves of their last household utensils were arrested and sent to Vyazhenska for being sympathetic to the Reds. In Tatarsk, the rich old Cossacks beat one younger Cossack, returned from his regiment, until the blood came, because he uttered aloud the one incautious remark, "Let the rich spoil their winnowing machines. Maybe they've got reason to fear the Reds more than ruin." The stocks of lead were melted down in the Vyazhenska workshop, but the finished bullets lacked nickel casings, and they also melted. When the rifles were fired, the leaden bullets flew half-melted from the barrel and were effective only over a distance of 300 yards. Nevertheless, the wounds inflicted by them were terrible. The 35,000 insurgents were divided into 5 divisions and a 6th Special Brigade. Grigory Melyukov was put in command of the 1st Division, which lay along the river Chira. His section of the front bore the brunt of the attack of Red detachments brought back from the main Donetsk line, but he succeeded not only in repulsing the pressure of the enemy, but in assisting the less reliable 2nd Division with cavalry and infantry reinforcements. The rising failed to spread northward as far as the Khapyevsk and Ust-Medvedets districts, although they were in a ferment, and messengers came from them asking for forces to be flung in the direction of the Buzuluk and the upper reaches of the Khoper in order to raise the Cossacks. The Cossack command could not resolve on an advance beyond the limits of the upper Don region, knowing that the great mass of the Khapyevsk Cossacks supported the Soviet regime and would not take up arms against it. Nor did the messengers inspire confidence, for they had to admit that the Cossacks discontented with the Reds did not number so very many, that the officers left behind in quiet corners of the districts were all in hiding. The front-line men were either at home or already in the Red forces, and the old men had neither strength nor their former prestige in the districts. In the Ukrainian districts to the south, the Reds had mobilized the young men, and they were fighting very willingly against the insurgents. Thus the rising was confined within the borders of the Upper Don region, and it grew clearer with every day and to every participant from the command downwards that they would not be able to defend their hearths and homes for long. Sooner or later the Red Army would turn back from the Donetsk front and crush them. On March 31st, Grigory Melyukov was recalled to Vyazhenska for a conference with the Supreme Command. He handed over command of his division to his assistant, Ryabchikov, and set off with his orderly early in the morning. He arrived at the staff headquarters at the very moment when Kudinov, the commander, was questioning a messenger from Khapyevsk district.